Hi, everyone. I hope you had a good week. And we're going to go on to another set of topics this week. So, we're going to go into sampling and recruitment. We're going to talk about participants, populations, EDI, although EDI is not my preferred way of looking at the world because we'll talk about that. But EDI as well, because we need to start thinking about equity, especially in qualitative work. Just a reminder that your assignments are due on February 7th. Most of you will probably watch this in advance of your assignment, so please go watch this video, watch week 4 before you turn in the assignment on the 7th before midnight. Please don't use AI in your writing, just practice it. It helps to improve your writing skills, and that's why I blacked out all of the writing help that you could have found in this nice tool. Um, I'm sure you can find it online if you were looking for it, but there are places you can go at the university website to find out how to do different kind of literature searches. There's a guide for doing lit searches. If you look it up on the U of T library site, you'll find it. Um, these are just specific areas that you could go. PubMed is fairly big if you're doing just health related stuff. Google Scholar is a great place because most scholars have to have their stuff there anyway. Knowledge maps. So I like Research Rabbit. If you've got a first paper that you want to look at, it can often give you a whole bunch that are either after it, before it, but from the same author. So it can tell you the connections. Connected Paper does the same thing. So does the Lit Maps. And Zotero and Mendeley are free. EndNote costs some money, but you can buy it from U of T. I prefer EndNote. That's just a personal preference. And if you're going to stay in grad school after your master's, you might want it because all of the papers that you're reading you can put into your EndNote for citations later. EndNote allows you to switch between citation styles. So if you're ever writing papers, you can have that as well. So just my personal preference is EndNote because you can put your PDFs and everything and notes in there. Just me, okay? Just saying. So this is just writing tools for you, and hopefully they're helpful. You can check out the LibGuide on writing and lit searches, and that will be helpful for you too. So I'm showing you a bunch of puppies because I got the opportunity in June to go with vet students who do wellness checks in First Nations communities. And this bundle of puppies, there was 8 of them, by the way, or 9 of them. It was kind of hard to bring them all in from somebody's car in to get all their wellness checks, but they were such a bundle of cuteness. Why does this matter? Because we have to think about, who we're going to be doing our research on. You could be doing it on dogs. It doesn't have to necessarily be humans. And you don't have to do just quant on the dogs. Maybe you want to look at, these are all siblings. What if you wanted to look at the coloring of each of the dogs and what the differences are? You could do it numerically. You would say 14 dogs came in and they had this coloring and 3 dogs didn't. You could look at their personalities. A whole bunch of things can happen without having to talk to a person. And that's part of what I wanted to show you. So depending on who your participants are, will also be reflective of your own positionality because you're going to choose something that you are excited by. And if you choose a topic that you're not excited by, chances are it's going to be a struggle. You're going to feel like you're walking through cement, like wet cement, instead of breezing across an ice rink, for example. It will make it very difficult because you're going to have trouble trying to figure out how to do your research because you aren't positioned within the community of the research you want to be in. So we have already looked at methodology. So we looked at ontology and epistemology. We looked at theories in week 3. We started talking about the research question as well. And then in week 4, we looked at reflexivity and positionality. Now, who are your populations that you want to look at? Who will your participants be? And we'll talk a little bit about sex and gender and EI, and how that relates to how you find your people, your participants, if you're doing people studies. So recruitment, participants, data. Oh my goodness, there's so much to think about. as in past weeks, I'm going to continue to talk to you about physiologic, which is on the right. But I want you to start, and I said this on week 2, you really need to conceptualize your variables. So you really have to determine how you're going to look at what you're doing. So this happens to be a medicine wheel. We talked briefly about this on week 2. But again, how you lay out how things are connected, maybe you won't do it this way. Maybe you're going to do the Venn diagram. But will you see enough of your variables at the end of the day when you're doing analysis is up to you. So you have to decide what your conceptualization of your variables and how you think they might overlap and how you're going to get that knowledge from the participants. Okay. And that will also help you with your method. But all of these things kind of happen concurrently and sequentially. It's really difficult for me to explain. And then you got to make sure you're advertising in the right places, right? And we're going to talk about that because it's really important to getting the right people to answer your questions. So the big question is it generalizability or transferability? And so generalizability is the degree that you can take your study findings and apply it to a larger community or a larger population. It can be more difficult to do that in qualitative research, but that doesn't mean it's impossible to do. So you need to think about how do you want to generalize from your study? Do you want to say all previously incarcerated Indigenous moms across Canada look the same as my sample here in Ontario? If it's no, great. If it's yes, then we have to figure out, are we sampling enough people in different regions of the country or who were incarcerated in different institutions or the like? That's what you got to think about. Transferability. Okay, so this is just one criteria, and you can decide whether it's helpful or not. You might decide that you want it to be able to transfer one context to another. So instead of wanting to do it all across Canada, my study was very much about in Ontario. Will my study then be transferable to Alberta or to BC or to the Yukon? Likely it will be. Although I think urbanization also plays a factor, and I didn't consider that when I was creating it. But with that being said, you want a random sample in most cases, but not all the time, because sometimes random samples don't get you to understand the complexity of human behavior, human or social behavior. And so, to select a random sample, you might need to know about the characteristics of the population. You'll need to know how rare the thing that you're trying to research is. Do you do a random sample to understand the normal distribution? Yes. But sometimes when we're talking about qualitative data, values and beliefs are different. We could just take a city block and we would hear different values and beliefs. There'll be some similarities, but we'd probably get a wide diversity. So is that representative of just that neighborhood? Can you generalize it to all of Toronto? Could you generalize it to all of Canada? And do you want to do that? Or do you want to transfer it and say in downtown Vancouver, they have a similar kind of neighborhood and it's very much the same in terms of what we heard here in Toronto. So you have to determine that. And why would you want to know that? Well, because sometimes you're trying to figure out if a problem is unique to, say, Toronto versus Vancouver or Ottawa. Or maybe you want to find out if it's unique to Canada and not Australia. Because I do Indigenous research, so often I think about where it's going to be situated in the bigger Indigenous research field. So again, it's what you're trying to accomplish. Where is this supposed to go? And so you need to keep thinking about your positionality and your reflexivity that we talked about last week. Where do you situate yourself and position yourself within your research? Because it's going to guide your research from beginning to end. And qualitative data cannot be collected without participants' willingness to tell you their stories. So when they tell you your story, there could be a lot of data in an hour's conversation, and how you pull that apart to analyze it, and that's coming in weeks to come, also can be hindered by whether you had a random sample or not. And so let's talk about different kinds of sampling. So you could have a purposeful sample I just put them in different colors. This doesn't mean green is go, yellow is like not, no. I'm not doing a Taylor Swift thing here. Purpose purposive sampling is the most common. So you're just going, okay, I have a research question, and these are the kind of criteria we want from the people that the participants that we want, demographic or social, and the values and attitudes that they have. And great, we're going to go on. Convenience sampling, which means that you're just, so I'm going, convenience would be taking our classroom and saying, all of you are going to be part of my sample or potentially a part of my sample. And those are the only people. It's not rigorous, but they're very easy. I see you guys every week. I can ask you the questions. I could do it in class or I could do it as interviews, but I have access to you. And so, you're just sub-selecting out of that sample. Maybe you do all of them, but you're selecting out of that sample. Theoretically, when you're doing it this way, when you're looking at your theory and it's driven by theory, then you're using the paradigm to determine what your sample should be. So often most people go to purposive sampling, but theoretical would mean like I'm a neo-Marxist, Marxist, and so I would probably be going to look for people who I deem to be part of the contemporary proletariat. And yeah, we can talk about that. But when we talked about theory back in week 3, I think I gave you enough that you could probably figure this out. So if you're talking about feminists, well, I want women, or maybe I want, and this is where sex and gender might come in. I don't want just women. I want people who identify as women. That might change where you try to locate your sample. So researchers are not always describing their sampling strategies in detail when they write their articles. So sometimes it's hard to interpret how, like, what the findings are and where they came from, because we don't really know their sample very well. But these are the 3 main types. That doesn't mean that there's not other types you can go to, but these 3 main types are the ones that you'll see qualitative researchers kind of lean towards. So, and sometimes they're used interchangeably, but they shouldn't be, because convenience samples can also be theoretically driven if I'm looking at an education theory, but I would not consider it, because there's so many classes at U of T I could have picked anywhere. So again, it's just how you're looking at it. So I'm having so much trouble today. Purposive sampling is really looking at the different dimensions, locations, the people or events. So who are we looking for, right? Are you looking for physicians who work in an emergency room? Are you looking for ones that work in like downtown Toronto versus, say, I don't know, North Bay? Are you looking for younger, mid-career, older? Where are you looking for your sampling? So being very mindful of who is included and who is excluded from a sample, that's what this is all about. So we're sampling, for example, we sample individuals who are diagnosed with COVID. So who do we want to look at? We want to select people who self-select probably, and also know that they've had COVID, whether they've done a rapid test or they were diagnosed in 2020 through a hospital test. And we want to talk to them about their experiences since COVID. So what has changed health-wise? See, that's the question we want to ask them. What other inclusion criteria could we put in there? We want them between the ages of 18 and 65. We want to have all sex and gender covered. We want to have them in different income brackets. What else could we talk about? Education. How would all of those factors, that positionality statement for your participants, then impact who you want to sample? And so when you're making your inclusion exclusion criteria, you have to make sure that you're very specific so that you have questions that you could do as pre-interview questions to determine if they can even be part of your sample, if that makes sense. So you really get to select information-rich studies, case studies, if you will, with people. So whether they're doing ethnography or they're doing interviews or they're doing photo voice, you are making sure that they're included because they actually fit the pieces to your theory or to what you think. And so you can still use purposive sampling when you're doing theoretical as well. There's blurred lines there. So when we think about convenience sampling, um, this is usually used for quantitative research, right? So they'll put out a big survey. For example, they'll put out the census, or they'll put out the Canadian Community Health Survey, or some other survey that you know of that's very large. And they will say, okay, we're going to figure out how to get to X number, and we're going to talk about power, but not right now. And that will help us to determine if we've reached enough people and we have enough voice. We don't generally do that in qualitative, but we can, right? So you might be doing a convenience sample because you're doing either ethnographies or autoethnographies and you're going to study them, or you're doing community-based participatory research. So again, it's kind of a sample, but not necessarily. And it often doesn't give us what we're looking for because you're asking participants that are already in the study to give us more people if we need more. So snowball sampling. But we would try to not use this in qual. This is a very quant kind of way. You can, specifically, I've done research on MPH, Indigenous health students, asking them about their pre and post going on the land with me. That's a convenient sample, right? Because I could ask other MPH students, but they've never been on the land with me. But they could kind of guess what it would be like. So again, it's what you are trying to get from your research questions. Theoretical sampling, again, this is all about positivism, right? It's all based on grounded theory. So I know we talked a little bit in week 3 about grounded theory, but I'm going to give you a little bit deeper knowledge on it. So Glaser and Strauss, when they were doing it, they needed the language to say what grounded theory was, right? So grounded theory is really, you don't have the full concept of what your research is going to uncover. And really what you want to do is you want to have qualitative research that will then start to base where you're going. But in theoretical sampling, that's not really what people were talking about. This grounded theory came much later in 67. So quantitative researchers often use this idea of theoretical sampling, even though they don't use theory. They may use, for example, they might use the determinants of health as a theory. It's not really a theory, but they might say, well, I want to have people that are at these intersections of the determinants. Like right now, there's the sustainable development goals. You could use the social determinants of health to kind of pick out your sampling from there. But we had essential workers in Toronto during COVID, and now think about the data that you get from them, the risks that they had to take on their own health, or if they were in healthcare, even more so, and how things got distributed while we were in COVID, and who they lived with, and who they were supporting. So if you do interviews in a theoretical sample and you're using grounded theory, it's going to constantly make you think about the data analysis before you've even finished your collection. So it's very rigid, and it's going to help you to see to the future, but sometimes it's not going to give you what you're looking for. It's not going to give you enough of a diversity of participants that will help you to then look at your data in a diverse way. So our sample size also makes a difference. So you might hear in quantitative research, they always talk about power, the power of things. How much power do you need? And that's why I bring it up, okay? Because a lot of my training was with quantitative researchers, even though they also did like mixed methods, and some of them did a little bit of qual. I was taught that even in qualitative research, we should be thinking about how many participants is enough. So How do you determine if it's enough? Saturation, again, Glaser and Strauss, as they were moving forward, started going, well, grounded theory needs you to know what saturation is. And often, if you read it in qualitative study now, people go, oh, I talked to 15 people and now I've got to saturation. I don't need to go to people. That's not true all the time. And so sometimes you think you've had it, you keep seeing or hearing the same thing, so you think that you're ready to stop the process. But it may be worth your while to determine how many participants you need at the beginning and try to stick to it or as close to it as you can. Saturation just means that you think that at 20 out of 30, you've heard everything and the last 10 aren't going to give you anything. And so you choose not to do them. But what if the last 10 gave you the most variability, but you don't know that because you never talked to them? That's why saturation may be a misnomer when we're doing qualitative research. It's easy to do that. But unlike quantitative research, if our aim is too broad, so I aim to understand blah, 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 or our target participants are too stratified, so there's too much diversity across them, or our theory is non-existent, which, again, we talked about in week 3, why it's so important, or there's no context or dialogue happening in the area that we're trying to research, it can then give you a very broad, superficial look at a topic. It doesn't make it so that it's good research. So you've got to really hone in on, where exactly are you trying to go? What is your aim? Make it very specific when you're doing your research question. Right? And you can have an aim or a goal, and then have your research question come from that. And that's very typical in qualitative research. You have to make sure that you're making your area small enough that you're not going, I'm going to go across Canada and I'm going to do interviews everywhere. We're not going to be able to do that. So thinking about all of those factors, especially in qualitative research, is very important. So what impacts the power of the sample size? Your goals and your aims, the uniqueness of your sample, your theory, the quality of data that you get back, and your analysis plan, which we're going to talk about in coming weeks. I think it's week 9, 10 or something. But these are very important when you start to think about what is the findings and how is this going to move research forward. So again, I want you to think about, we have a narrow focus as qualitative researchers, and our group of participants is much smaller. Our theory is applied to it. We have strong dialogues with the people we do interview or do work with as participants. Our analysis is informed by our theory, and it's also established in our dissemination and our plan. So just remembering all of these things are part of what sample size does for us, right? So we've talked a little bit about, how to get a sampling. This is the size of the sample. But sampling and methods also have to make sense to answer your research question. So what are the aims of your project? Like, what is your overarching goal for this project? I want to know how many people have purple glasses. Where do I want to know that for? Let's say Toronto. That's still like 4 million people. Okay. So why do I want to know they have glasses, purple glasses? I want to differentiate between people who have purchased purple glasses and blue glasses. And I'm talking about my brains. So again, you have to be very specific because otherwise your sample is going to get all messed up, and you're going to pick the wrong participants and not get enough diversity or too much diversity. The other thing is you want to make sure that you can actually achieve what you were trying to look at. So while we don't have hypotheses in qualitative for the most part, research, our theories kind of give us a sense where we're going. It's our lens, it's our way of looking at the world, and your positionality plays into that. And that helps us to become more inclusive. So regardless if you like the red beads, the blue beads, the teal beads, the green beads, you get to decide as a participant if you fit in the study or don't, right? And so let's pretend all of the cups are participants and they fit in the study, but these guys don't. There's some kind of exclusionary criteria that sets them apart. That is up to you as a researcher to ensure that you are being inclusive and ensuring that you have a diversity, because there is no light green in the cups. Maybe we actually do need light green's voice at the table. So it's you that has to determine that before you start, or reflexively looking at why you would want to change your criteria. Qualitative research does not have to be with humans, on humans, for humans. Could be. Doesn't have to be that way. I could look at people's ribbon skirts or their regalia and do a whole qualitative research study on the differences between different First Nations communities and what they wear in ceremony or at powwow, that kind of thing. I could look at the kind of plants people like to grow in their homes and whether they choose to do indoor gardening or outdoor gardening. I don't have to talk to the people. I could just ask for photos, and that means I'm not actually talking to a human. I could look at people's beadwork or other artistic pieces and determine, like I could say that people that use blue are symbolically what? Because we could ask them, picking colors. There's only so many, and they could, they do stuff that way. So you could also pick out what kind of stitches they use or patterns that they try to follow. Similarly, you could get people to do artwork, and you could ask them one question, and never talk to them again, and just ask them to submit artwork. So you're not really doing the traditional interview or focus group. Rather, you're giving them an artistic or arts-based method by which to do their data. Or you could do a full document analysis. This is part of the Indian Act from the 1800s. So you could have somebody just like reading document after document, like historians do, like anthropologists do, like people that want to find out what happened then to make it the way it is today. So don't think that qualitative research only has to be with humans. It doesn't necessarily have to be. So textual data, which I do want to bring this up because a lot of people think that qualitative data has to be with a human. These are still humans that created all of this text data that we then want to look at. I didn't add social media. It is a whole other thing. But I mean, like you go on X or Blue Sky or Truth Social or wherever or Threads and pick up people's data from there, and you would have to determine if they're in or out based on certain questions, or you do your inclusion exclusion. Why is this important? Because textual data means that you're not actually going to be talking to a human being. And that changes how you get your sample and what kind of participants you want. So you may still want to do key informant interviews after you've gone and found text data. That's not to say that it's perfect. It's not, but maybe you have a preconceived knowledge of what you're hoping to find. Okay. We need to define participants. I know this seems like it's counter, but we're moving from the sample to the participant itself. So your research question in your theory is going to determine who you want to interact with: gender, sex, age, health condition, experiences, intersections, positionalities. That's pretty standard. I think you got that part. What makes them different than other non-participants? So this is that inclusion, exclusion, and that criteria is really important to what you're doing. So what do you want to, like, who would you want to talk to or interact with? What would that look like? Do you want a sample that's very heterogenic or homogenic? So you want them very mixed and diverse, or do you want them very much the same because you're trying to answer a specific kind of question? And then what kind of sampling methods are you doing, right? So that gets back to purposive theoretical inconvenience, and it also gets into your method, the method that you're going to draw upon. So are you doing ethnographies? Are you doing arts-based? Are you doing community-based participatory action research? that might also help you to define who your participant is, right? And then think about how you're going to manage your expectations, because there's limitations for your student time. So you've got to finish a degree. How much time do you have to actually do that? What happens if they don't fit? What are you going to say to the participants if they don't fit the criteria that you're looking for? You need to have that all set up in advance. And how are you going to recruit? So recruitment strategies are huge. You can have key informants that you already know are leaders in the field, for example, physicians, or you might want to talk to student reps who can get to students and they can do a snowball sample for you. Or you might want to just do snowball sampling right at the gate, and you just use like social media or word of mouth to get it out to other participants, and then you'll have your strategy. You might do tools, you might like do your own flyers or social media. The cautionary tale, sometimes when you use those, you get the wrong people. So how are you going to find these people? So you got to think about what places are they going to, what environments or associations may you go to try to find them. Will they be collaborative or low interest in the kind of research you're doing, or do they want to be partners? Like there's a whole spectrum of ways that they might want to be part of your recruitment strategy and of the project. Who's going to find them? So is it going to be you? Are you going to spend time and build relationships with the people that you want to interview? Or are you going to keep a power imbalance or that researcher observer kind of thing where you're not part of the research that you're doing, but we all know you are. So you can do that. And what if your questions aren't right or you don't approach them properly? Like, what will you do then in terms of recruitment? And maybe you'll lose them if you want to do multiple renditions of interviews or contacts. Who will contact who? So do you want them to contact you? Or do you want somebody else to contact them? So again, you have to have all this sitting when you do ethics, and we're going to talk about ethics in future weeks. You need all of this set up and ready to go. Emailing sounds great, but sometimes it gets lost. It goes into somebody's spam folder or junk folder. Sometimes they'll answer you twice and then they just kind of fall off the face of the earth because something happened in their life and you don't know anything about them. And then when do you send that email? Do you send it at 9 a.m. because that's when you start your day, or do you send it at 11 o'clock at night because that's when you know that this person might have access to a computer? So again, you have to think about all these things. And then when you engage with them, what does that mean? Like, what are expectations for you to engage with them? Is it just to conduct the interview? Do you want to talk to them about other things? Those kinds of things. And then just be aware that sometimes you have attrition challenges, especially if you're doing longitudinal studies or inherent designs where you're going to have multiple times when you see the person. So back to Kiji Magic. So I'm going to just give you this. We had everybody who self-identified, First Nations, Inuit, or Métis. You had to self-identify as a mother or a mother figure. So you had given birth, adopted, fostered, stepped in, or were socially considered a mother. You had to be incarcerated, preferably more than 3 months, but must have served some time in a jail, prison, or other correctional facility. And there was no timeline for when you were a mother and or incarcerated, so you could have one then the other. We found out the hard way that wasn't what we wanted, but it was much later in the game when we figured that out. And it didn't matter how long you were incarcerated or how long you were a mother. We did recruitment through our community partners first because they had access to previously incarcerated Indigenous moms. And then we did it through social media. Now I'm going to tell you the little story. So we put it up on back then Twitter and Instagram, and we were getting people answering. And when we would ask them the questions, they could get all of the screening questions right. We get into the interview and we find out they're not actually First Nations, Métis, or Inuit, or they haven't had any kids, or they were arrested but never charged and never put into jail. So you end up having to pay the honorarium anyway, and you don't have anything to show for it. So that's the problem with social media. But it is a way to get it out. We distributed flyers in person at our partners and in other community organizations, and we had people with lived experience also help us to recruit. So that was our way in Kijibajik to doing that. Our sample size, we were aiming for 20, but we ended up interviewing 30 because we had people from social media who weren't actually um, eligible candidates. And so we had to keep going. We had 1 year to complete the interviews and then another year and a half to do the analysis. And we finished that, but we haven't finished the writing. So just FYI, it takes a lot of time. So how many participants is enough participants? Well, that's not the right question. You have all these ducks answer a question. It may not help you. You have 1,000 people answer, you know, a 10 minutes interview, and it may not give you the quality of data that you need. It might not answer your question properly. It takes you away from your original aim of the project. There may not be any social relations or that connect back to your aim or your question. People might think that they're answering you in the way that you're looking for, but they are going on a whole different tangent because your question wasn't built properly. So how much you know and how much you want them to get you, it's not a linear process. You're more than welcome to make it an iterative and live process that will change as you go through. Don't worry about the number. However, we also have to worry about the number. But it shouldn't be your primary. Sample size isn't just about how many. It's about, are we going to meet the issues that we said we wanted to address in the proposal. So there's often power imbalances when we do this kind of research. Researchers are seen as professional and they're getting paid. I say this as a First Nations scholar. I too build my career off the backs of First Nations people, not because I'm trying to, but my job requires me to interact, research, and then publish on Indigenous people, which means that I'm getting credit for things that they have said in my research. Even if they got an honorarium, am I really helping them? Probably not as much as they're helping me. We also have a lot of people who are persuaded to be part of research without fully understanding the risks to their health, their safety, or like what's going to happen with the research outcomes. So this happens quite a bit in Indigenous communities, but I think it happens in other made vulnerable communities where people are asked to do an interview or a focus group or a talking circle, and then they do this, but we don't think about their health and safety as they're coming to attend. So maybe we're talking about intimate partner violence, or we're talking about lateral violence, or maybe it's even less harmful than that. We're talking about child abuse and neglect, or we're talking just about early childhood, and something comes up that we then have to think about, do we report that? So we have to really think about those things because there's a power imbalance, right? If we never came into your life, nothing would have happened. So how do we then mitigate that risk? A lot of Indigenous individuals often feel pressured to participate in studies, and they feel that their community will get very angry if they don't, and so they do it anyway, even when they feel uncomfortable. Even if we build good rapport, and sometimes in spite of building good rapport and a relationship, people feel like we misinterpreted what they said, or we gave the information to somebody in their community and now it's spreading. Again, you have to mitigate for these things. And you can sensationalize a problem. TikTok ban is a prime example. It went down. Everybody was like, "Oh my God, it's gone! What are they doing? That's our rights." And then it was back within 12 hours. Why am I saying this? Because the same thing can happen, right? You could say, I don't know, the diabetes rate amongst First Nations people is extremely high at 3 to 5 times the rate of non-Indigenous people. But when you do that, that has impacts on the individuals in communities who, they don't have the resources to rectify the situation. So we have to be very careful about, and I'm just talking Indigenous, but I mean, we could pick any group and that probably happen. Similarly, they take blood samples. Henrietta Lacks is a perfect example of this. They took her blood sample and they learned about cancer. Like these are things that shouldn't be happening, right? And so I'm telling you this because that's a power imbalance when you have that kind of control. Remember, we were talking about power and positionality and privilege, and this is a privilege to be able to do this kind of work, and it's our power that we can make change. So I want you as a qualitative researcher to ask these questions of yourself. Whose research is this? If you're doing it for your master's, your PhD, so whose is it at the end of the day? Yours or the people that you invited to talk to you? Who owns it after? Are you going to see it on your computer? Are you going to put it in a data sphere, like whose data sphere? Who's interested in it, sir? Yours, the community, government, funder? Who will benefit from it? You obviously will, but who else benefits from it? Who has designed it? Its questions, the framing, the scope, the aim, all of those things. Who had the ability to have input onto your design? Who carries it out? You? Somebody from community? Like, how are you doing this? Who's writing it up? You? Who's analyzing? You? So you got to think about these things because it also shows your power imbalance, right? And how will the results be disseminated? I go to remote communities or communities that some of them are flying, some of them I'm gonna drive in, but if I'm gonna just do a journal article, do you really think they're gonna have access to that? Remember, I asked you about like when you pull a journal article, do you actually think about who the authors are? This is exactly why. So if I'm gonna only do it in that manner, nobody that I actually interviewed is actually ever gonna see it unless I do it in like a webinar or I go to community or I'm on the radio or TV station. At least in First Nations, that's very true. And so I think that probably happens in non-First Nations or Indigenous communities too. How do you get it back out to the right people? So that brings us to evaluation tools for research. So I'm just showing you one. It's called iReach, which is the Intervention and Research Readiness Engagement and Assessment of Community Healthcare. iReach. Marion Marr created this back in the early part of the 2010s. And this just looks at participating at participatory consensus cycles. So if I mean you can go read this, it's just asking you to do this checklist so that you start to understand things about working with Indigenous people. You could do this with any community. Just make yourself a checklist. Where is it? Like it's basically what we were just talking about. Like how do we then make sure that we're not burdening any group of people? And that you're providing the community with ethical spaces for engaging with you. So that the power dynamic and the risk for power dynamics is reduced. And you allow for discussion and collaboration all the way through. I realize we have to do that in First Nations research, but you should be doing that in every research. And having innovative partnerships that are not siloed. It's not just public health. It's not just nutrition. It's not just Black health. Ones that are more transdisciplinary often bring about the best results because then you're seeing things from a whole bunch of different perspectives with a whole bunch of different knowledges, as well as people with lived experience as part of your analysis team. Okay. And you want to make sure that there's frequent engagement with everybody who's part of your research because that also helps you to be reflexive all the way through and makes it so that you're looking at your qualitative aims keep going. And partnerships, they fail because you don't talk to them and you don't have relationships with them. So if you really want to keep your relationship strong, you need to keep talking to people. It's just like any kind of relationship. You're not talking to them. It's all going to disappear, right? And dissipate. So different tools might need you to do different things. And I just want to remind people that Western methods are not the only methods out there, not the only tools for doing research. So while Western researchers use interviews, I use kitchen table talks, which is like we're doing right now. I'm sitting in front of you, we're having a coffee, and we're having a discussion. And I do more active listening than talking because I want the participants to talk. In this situation, I'm acting like the participant and talking to you. Focus groups. That's when we do talking circles or sharing circles or feasts sometimes, because if you have a feast going on, people are eating and talking. It's wintertime. Traditionally, this is when we do storytelling. So you might ask somebody to do art or tell you a story that relates to something that you're interested in. So you got to find the tools that help your participants to feel safe while they're in your research. Now I'm going to get into the EDI part. And I know I talked to you a little bit about this last week. I'm not a big fan of EDI because as a First Nations scholar, I have been made vulnerable by systems. I didn't marginalize myself. I didn't other myself. I'm not vulnerable because I made myself that way. The systems have made me vulnerable. They have marginalized me. So I'm either made marginalized, made vulnerable, made at risk. I didn't do that. And when we use that language, it is hugely, hugely going against EDI, period. And what happens is, as a First Nations professor, there are 23 or 25 Indigenous professors at the University of Toronto out of 3,900, which is less than 1%. And I have experienced where I get minority taxed, where I'm asked to do a whole bunch of things or look at a whole bunch of things. And so while we're trying to create equity, I don't get to start on the same platform. I'm like this little dude over here in the equality. I understand you want me to do this to make it better, but I don't have the tools or the time to do all the things you're asking of me. And so EDI can become more taxing on the people that actually need it to work for them, instead of giving them an equity where I would get all of the support I need in order to help you to understand the problem. I don't know if that makes sense, but I hope it does. So you have to meet people where they're at. If I'm always on the same level as somebody, obviously I'm not always going to be getting the same amount. So I may need more boxes to get to where everybody else is, or more tools to make it work like everybody else. And I'm sure there are inequalities that you can think of, and then inequities that you can think of. So with that being said, some inequalities might be that all professors get the same office size, but some of us have more people coming to our offices. I don't know, I'm just trying to pick something, right? Or we don't get the same amount of or we all get the same amount of funding, but really, if there's only 23 Indigenous scholars across U of T, then should we get a little bit more money because we're going to need to bring other people to help us with the stuff we're required to do as professors in order to have the time to do the things that would make the university more equitable for us. And then you have to think about equality gives most people a chance to thrive, but equity means that everybody gets to thrive. Do you have it? So when you think about positionality, do you have equity or do you have equality? So again, your positionality also plays a factor in equity, diversity, and inclusion. And we use EDI in Canada, but I think it's DEI in the United States, and I think it's just inclusion in the UK. Like, it's all the same things, but the thing is, our positionality, our privileges, our power, all of that has a lot to do with what kind of equity you have, right? And how we see equity and diversity and inclusion. And so as a qualitative researcher, it's also important for you to understand that it can't be just human based, right? We have to remember plants and animals and documents and trees and birds and fish and insects, air, water, soil. Like, you think of anything, all my relations, and they all need to get equity. So I have a paper that I've never published on giving personhood rights to plants, animals, trees, birds, fish, insects, because as long as we treat them as resources, then it's okay to deplete them, right? Because they're not seen as kin to us. They're not seen as anything but expendable. And so we need to change that viewpoint. So if we examine our 3 Ps, then we can start to look at equity and inequity and how that plays into qualitative research is around that whole idea that we need to be looking at who we are in order to help boost to the place where we're getting to equity, not equality. So I show this picture often and that's why I don't like our classroom so much, because I can't look at every person. I can see all of you in rows, but you can't see each other. So if we were to sit in a circle, everybody would get to see each other. And that means that nobody's above or below, ahead or behind, because we're all in the same circle and we're all moving at the same pace together. And so I want you to think about what life would be like if we didn't have diversity. So I want you to look at all of these chairs are very different and unique. What if we all wanted the same chair? How would we rectify that? Like what would we do if everybody wanted the rocking chair, right? What if everybody wanted to sit in the rocking chair tomorrow? Or what if everybody wants the lazy boy? What do we do? And that's what having diversity is like. We want that diversity because we can see things and go, oh, that's fantastic. I'm not talking about money or power. I am talking about, oh my God, I want to learn more about this, or oh, I want to try that experience. That's what I'm talking about. What if we all chose the same clothing and the same color, size, shape? Then there would be no clothes. How would everybody get clothes? How do we clothe them? That's a qualitative question, right? Like, how would you make everybody equitable without screwing up systems? Or do we want to screw up the system? What if everybody chose the same foods to eat? How do we ensure that everybody's got enough food? So diversity also helps us to see things in a new and different way, right? Not one of these ribbon skirts is the same, and yet these are all Indigenous ribbon skirts. So having that diversity also helps us to be unique and helps qualitative research to get the depth and the richness out of interviews, out of focus groups, out of arts-based methods that is so heavily important in qual. So that brings me to exclusion, adaptation, and inclusion. So when I say this, capitalism and colonialism, these structures and systems that have been created, have excluded vast numbers of people. And I don't want to get into particulars, but with doing that, you've made people vulnerable, or they've had to choose things that assimilate them into these systems, like education, employment, because otherwise they wouldn't survive. So it's a survival thing too, right? So what if we could fit everybody like this, like as puzzle pieces, right? Instead of Jenga boxes or blocks? So I have to thank my daughter, Frankie Pringle, made that nice graphic for me. But this is the way that I see the world. Everything's interconnected to you. Like the puzzle doesn't go away. And I have to realize that they're all my relations and all of me too, right? This is the way Western capitalist society sees everything. These are resources. You can take those resources and do with them what you will. So if we take that as an example, when we want to include people, should we not be trying to figure out how we can fit them in without assimilating them? Because we want their uniqueness. We want that diversity. So how do we bring them in without making everybody homogeneous, right? Like we don't want that. We want the diversity. When people are sitting in my learning lodge when I'm on the land, they're very different in how they sit and how they listen to the teachings. So we have to figure out how that can work. And it's often put on the backs of the people that are most made vulnerable to try to figure that out. So what I'm saying to you is when you're thinking about your qualitative research, especially if you're not of the group that you're going to study, how are you bringing them in without placing all of the work on them? To bring in more people, do you pay them? Like, think of the ways in which you can make it better for them. So we need to eliminate barriers. Humans are being in the world. We make mistakes all the time. Every one of us. I don't know a perfect person. And if I did, I would not recognize it anyway. I want you to think about how when you're bringing somebody in for research, when I'm on the land, I understand that elders sometimes have trouble getting on dirt grounds because they have a wheelchair or a walker or a cane. So we do things in order to help them to get to where we're doing ceremony. How do we do that in our research? So when you're thinking about where you're going to have your interviews, will people with any kind of disability be able to do them? What if they have a speech impediment? What if they have a cognitive developmental issue? How are you going to give them the instructions? Is it just you're going to send them the written consent form that they're going to read again when they're sitting in front of you? Like, all of these can be barriers that you can eliminate because we all have different styles and abilities. This is all part of EDI and how you bring it in. So you have to think about, some people are very auditory. They need to hear it so that they understand what the consent form is. They need to hear what the study is about. Others want to read it. They want to understand what it is before they even say they're going to be part of it. You have to eliminate as many of those barriers as you can from beginning to end. So that should be part of your methodology. Most of the things we've talked about over the past few weeks have been about social constructs, right? We didn't get here and we didn't need EDI if we didn't start thinking about social Darwinism back in the 1800s. Charles Darwin wrote about the origin of species. What he was talking about was birds and some other animals, but mostly birds and plants. He was showing that if you followed the lineage of a certain bird, you would see that over generations they kind of change. They conform or mutate, if you want, based on where they are. So a bird that would be in the Rockies in the United States versus a bird that would be in the Rockies as you're going into the Yukon or Alaska would be a different bird. Yeah. And that's what he was talking about. But do you know what happened? We had people who looked at Darwin and went, oh my God, that must be the same for people. The color of your skin must dictate something about you. Or when they met different groups as they were conquering places or trying to conquer places, they'd say that you don't have a civilized way of living. So you don't have a governance structure. You don't have a written language. You don't have this. You don't have that. And therefore, you're less than human. And so social Darwinism created racism because it told you that you were this race or this ethnicity or that ethnicity, and which languages were superior. This comes from colonization over different empires over time. So why am I telling you this? Because EDI is a reflection of still incorporating social constructs and thinking that we're going to use a different way of thinking to get us out of those social constructs. It's not going to happen. And so I agree with the underpinning of what EDI is supposed to do and EDI work, but eugenics also plays into this, right? There's this whole movement that if you were lighter skinned, you're better than darker skinned people, right? And in Canada, we had a eugenics society. And in fact, I just found out in the last couple of years that the K-8 school that I went to in Kitchener was named after one of the major eugenics people in Ontario. Didn't know that. Didn't know that then. Still didn't, only just found that out. What does that mean? Because when you have difference like that, it breeds hate. Because those social constructs divide us. And as long as we're going to divide us, we're going to start to hate each other. It's going to create racism because race is a social construct. You're still a human being. First and foremost, you're a human being. And how we deal with that in our research is up to you. You can be compassionate and make change, or you can just keep doing the status quo. So this week, I want you to just spend a little bit of time. You don't have to do this if you don't want to. It's just so that you can kind of get a sense about these things. But for sampling and recruitment, I want you to take one or two of the things that we talked about today or something that you've put into your first assignment. And I want you to think about what your recruitment sampling or your recruitment strategy would be and, things that we talked about in class today. And is there a way that you can see the strengths and weaknesses to the way that you wanted to recruit or the way you should recruit? How EDI plays into those strengths and weaknesses? Can that help to identify some of the other issues that maybe you hadn't thought of? And then I want you to think about how you would work with your peers. So say you were doing the second assignment, which you can do two of you together for the assignment two. If you were to work together, how are you going to like blend your two thoughts together? How are you going to improve your strategies, your research question, all of those things for the second assignment? With that, I will see you next week, and I hope you had a wonderful week and you stay warm.